All right, everybody, we are back in for our 5 p.m. presentation. Please welcome Amandah Altamirano, who will be presenting on women of color's experiences in video game culture. Amandah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. My name is Amandah Altamirano. I recently just graduated from the Master of Arts program in sociological practice at California State University, San Marcos. And so today I'm going to be presenting on my thesis, which was focusing on women of color's experiences in video game culture. And so this research really stemmed from my own experiences. I grew up in video game culture since literally when I was born. And it wasn't until high school that I realized that women and women of color weren't welcome in this community that has been built on male dominance and toxic masculinity. What really started it was my first gamer tag had my first name in it. It had a lot of feminine identities included in it, and so people picked up a lot on what my identity was. And because of that, I was met with a lot of identity-based harassment in voice chat, in text chat, and even when I used to work at a video game store in person. And with those experiences, I really wanted to really understand why that was happening to me when I began graduate school, but also see if I could uplift other stories because women of color have really become this silent community in video game culture. And, there needs to be social change so that we can truly live in a culture where this video game is meant for everyone to be played by everyone. And as I mentioned, male dominance has been rooted in video game culture since the beginning. I always say that even in the pinball stages before we had Wi-Fi and a lot of online modalities, because it was marketed towards only for boys and men, and we can even include race and class in that as well. And so, because of this normality that has been pushed by this marketing of these games are for boys and men, and those were for first person shooter games and a lot of the esport games that we see that are very competitive. And for girls and women, they were pushed to play games that were more in terms of caretaking. And so, like kitchen simulators, caretaking for the family, Diner Dash was part of the research that I found from, I believe it was Chang. And because of that, it's really kind of built this division in video game culture of who this community is meant for, who can partake in it. And unfortunately, women and girls have been pushed to be silent and take part in gender masking that strips away what makes them human from the culture. And so I clearly state the problem that there is a division on race, gender, ethnicity. And because of identity based harassment, it's led to an increase of social hierarchies that are enabled by the industry. But also, we see some community members do partaking in a lot of hate speech that takes in the form of trash talking. Trash talking happens a lot in first person shooter games, and a lot of the games that we see that are highly competitive that rely on that cooperation in voice and text chat. And trash talking has become this like fundamental part of the culture where a lot of the youth do engage in verbal hate speech against the opposing players to kind of get a rile out of them, but even their own teammates, if their own teammates aren't participating or performing to the best of their abilities or just having, a rough game. And because of this normalization of hate speech through trash talking, a lot of the social issues that we see, especially for women of color, it's swept under the rug and not taken seriously. A lot of the times they're met with, it's just trash talking, it's nothing serious. But it is serious when it is an attack on their personal identity. I took it a step forward with my research and also included live streaming. And so a lot of women of color are met with this derogatory label of titty streamers that really takes away their identity and strips what makes them human, but also kind of tries to delegitimize them from the community. And so I call it like a triple oppression where they're experiencing oppression in person, experiencing oppression in multiplayer games, and now experiencing oppression in live streaming. And there's a lot of emotional labor that goes into it where they have to perform and do gender based on what is expected by society, but also to survive. So kind of performing in dolled up appearances, bubbly personalities, and acting like it's not bothering them. And so this has pushed a lot of women of color to silently live, but also have to unfortunately take part in these ideas of doing gender so that they can participate. I won't spend too much time on this, but this was my literature review from my project. And so I had 5 different areas focusing on how is race and gender represented in video game culture that does impact this identity of the default gamer, which is the default gamer is white, male, cisgender, heterosexual. And so if anyone doesn't fit those characteristics, they're met with identity-based harassment. And so then I had women of color abuse in online multiplayer games. How are they navigating it? How are they experiencing it in these sorts of games? And then this hypersexualization and harassment of women in video game live streaming. And then lastly, trying to survive, so coping strategies. I like to say that those coping strategies are unhealthy as well because that's what's pushing them away from the community and pushing them to be silent existers in video game culture. And so the methodology of my research, I did a qualitative research focusing with the theoretical framework of symbolic interactionism to really understand the connections and meanings from these interactions. What is inspiring these people to have interactions online, especially in a male-dominated online environment, and what meanings are being taken out of those interactions for the women of color. Part of symbolic interactionism, I had doing gender. So how are women of color having to do gender that meets the societal standards of being a woman of color? And then I had critical race feminism theory to really understand the unique intersecting experiences of being a woman and also a person of color, since that brings unique experiences when they're put together. And so I initially had a participation interest survey where I collected demographics such as self-identified of race, ethnicity, and their age, and what their experience was with online capable consoles and live streaming. They could have either or and both to participate in the research, and it was limited to women of color. And so I had 10 semi-structured interviews, semi-structured so I can build rapport and trust with women of color since they were releasing a lot of vulnerable stories with me during this interview over Zoom. And so I asked them about their exposure to video game culture and what their general experiences was. One unique thing about my study was that my participants, none of them were introduced to video game culture by a woman figure. All of them were introduced by a male figure. And so they ranged from 18 to 39 years of age and self-identified as a woman and transgender woman, Mexican American, Chicana, Hispanic, Black, Filipino, and half white Korean. And so from the research and from the interviews that I collected, I did code by hand. And so when I was doing coding, I was trying to figure out patterns, what was connecting to the research, what was unique about the research, and what are some reoccurring themes going on. And so I came up with the following themes. So how are women of color experiencing and how are they navigating identity-based harassment? And I have more themes in the next few slides. And in terms of experiencing identity-based harassment in video game culture, a lot of women experience this harassment in voice and text chat that is encouraged by anonymity. And the question I got the most from a lot of participants and people around me is, how does harassment happen in an online modality when you can't see what the person looks like? Well, because of linguistic profiling, a lot of auditory cues are picked up by other players, and they're using those cues to determine the identity of that player so that they can move forward with identity-based harassment. And because they're anonymous and we can even hide, IP addresses with a VPN these days, they're behaving in ways that they wouldn't if it was an in-person conversation. And so that encourages a lot of people to behave in ways they wouldn't if they were, in person. And so connecting this to esports, so the rise of toxic competitiveness and the pressure to perform has impacted a lot of the experiences for women of color in these spaces. So with the rise of esports, and I remember I loved esports. I loved watching it, especially Call of Duty growing up. But because of this, rise of toxic competitiveness, everyone is in some way performing to get to that point. And so if they have a bad game, if their team isn't quote unquote, picking up the slack, then they're using that trash talking, which is hate speech, to really delegitimize, but also disencourage their fellow teammates and the opposing enemy. And competitiveness has really brought that forward because it almost seems that every game is life or death at that point. And so there has been this pressure to perform, especially as a woman of color, because if they don't perform, then they're met with identity-based harassment that is directed to their race and gender. And so playing with strangers has become a really big issue for women of color because they feel that they have to think about other people's intentions that they don't know. And so they would rather just silently be playing the game and not participate in voice and text chat, which I will get to in one of the findings as well. And there was a lot of emotional labor as well with video game live streaming. So a lot of women feeling a lot of pressure to have makeup on, to have, low revealing clothing, to seem happy and bubbly. So that way they weren't met with oppression, but even while doing that, they were still being met with oppression. They would be called a titty streamer if they did engage in emotional labor. And if they didn't, they were met with a lot of criticism on their appearance that also delegitimized them. And so, how are women of color navigating through this? So, what are they doing to avoid these experiences? And so, these are the quote unquote unhealthy coping mechanisms. And so, they're avoiding male dominated video games. And so, a lot of those games are those competitive games like Call of Duty, Battlefield. Battlefield was the first thing that came to my mind because literally yesterday I was attacked for my identity while in a multiplayer game and voice text chat. And so because of that, a lot of women of color have chosen to avoid that by playing only single player games. So you don't have to consider that happening or the intentions of strangers. And so that has really limited to the types of games that they can partake in. And they're also participating in gender masking. So what gender masking looks like is creating gender neutral gamer tags that strips away any part of their identity that they can be oppressed by. And so this is a form of restricting identifying information so that way they can maintain anonymity for their own safety while playing a game that is quote unquote made for everyone. And while doing this, there's a lot of internalization of this harassment and ignoring the harassment has also contributed to internalization. So a lot of my participants, they didn't even realize that they were internalizing it so much that when they did finally talk about it and open up about it, it led to a lot of emotional responses because they didn't understand why they weren't allowed to partake in this community, why they weren't allowed to play certain games, why they were being attacked for their identity, why women of color couldn't play the same games as, men. And so this internalization has kind of led them to believe that they're the problem, when in reality, it's this normalization of toxic masculinity that has embedded itself in this area. And so a lot of women of color did find power to challenge this social issue. And so what that looks like is a lot of women just started partaking in voice chat and text chat and ignoring what's being said. But as I mentioned, that a lot of the ignoring, a lot of women still do take that internally. I mean, it's hard not to, we're all human. And so even while we're challenging it, still part of it does impact us internally. And so these were the last two themes I did have. And so continuing this conversation of navigating, so I originally had this as positive experiences in video game culture. What are the happy moments in this culture? And so it really, after analyzation, it appeared that these were forms of resistance to this male domination, to this toxic masculinity, showcasing that they can enjoy and partake in this community despite identity-based harassment. And so this idea of creating and maintaining relationships despite geographical location, they were able to maintain connection with their significant others, their family members, not even just like outside the state, but like on a global scale. And so finding this camaraderie and protection as well. So they were able to find community despite identity-based harassment, find friends online that ended up being long-lasting. I had a participant that had been homeschooled her whole entire life, and she met two other players who were homeschooled their entire life as well. And now they're meeting up in person and creating a long-lasting relationship because they were able to find connection in this online space. And so this idea of creating and expressing joy is something we need to capitalize on, but also ensure that our entire player base is able to partake in that. And so enjoying streaming with friends and engaging the audience is similar to that as well, because as they were playing with friends, they were able to ignore the oppression happening in their Twitch chat and their YouTube chat, Instagram chat, and just plainly enjoy having a good time with friends and making memories. And so with that, my participants took everything that they said in the interview, and I asked them, what would they change in video game culture? And so they used all their experiences and what they just shared with me to name two things that they would change. And these were the two themes. So naming the problem. So really naming that there is a problem with resistance to social change, and that we really need the backup of our industry to really like help with the idea of increasing representation, increasing storylines that are empowering, that are impactful, that all communities can relate to, and having an increase of that visibility of people of color and those unique stories. And so really, how can our industry really help with that social change? You know, looking in terms of what can we do differently, and how can we strip away this toxic masculinity and create a culture that is welcoming of all identities. And also this emphasization of less sexualization, more representation and acceptance. So even though there is a woman of color character in a game, that character is oftentimes very sexualized. And so it doesn't create this meaningful, impactful connection to this character. And so a lot of my participants felt that whenever they would see that representation, but it was sexualized, it really felt like they still had nothing, like nothing had been listened to them, and any type of movement going forward to being more inclusive and respectful. But what was really sad but interesting is that a lot of the participants said they just wanted acceptance. They just wanted to play these games. They just wanted to simply be competitive, engage in esports, and they were also really determined to make it into esports, but they found it difficult because a lot of times esports is male dominated, and there's not a lot of women of color or women representation in esports. And so even though they were, doing the Twitch streaming, playing every day and practicing, they didn't feel accepted because they didn't see the representation and felt that that representation wouldn't be accepted at the table. And so just plain acceptance was one of the major things found in this study. Considering time, and I'm happy I still have time left, I did pull some quotes that was shared from my participants in the research that were really impactful. And so this slide really shows the negative experiences that are tied to identity-based harassment. And so a lot of times participants experiencing racial slurs because of their identity, and it's impacting them, and they're taking that internalization that they're the problem because of their identity in multiplayer games. A lot of times women were stressed out because they were forced to play healer roles, which have been more assigned to women. And women have been discouraged from playing DPS and tank roles. I'm thinking of Overwatch, for an example, off the top of my head. And so really stressing that they have to perform well in order to, be safe, in order to enjoy it, in order to continue playing another round of gaming. And if they were met with identity-based harassment because they weren't performing well, they would just simply give up and log off of the game. And so a lot of vulgar language being used in these online multiplayer spaces. But also there's an example in the longer quote that her boyfriend invited her to play Rainbow Six Siege, but she didn't want to because she didn't want to have to think about people's intentions. She didn't want to have to think about what if I get attacked because of my identity, because I couldn't pick up the game quick enough, and because simply I'm a woman. And so she would just rather play single player games. Not that that's a problem, but she'd rather play single player games where she didn't have to think about that. And so these are more of the empowering quotes. And so a lot of, finding women empowerment, finding full teams with all women, that really brought this sense of camaraderie, like, oh, we can finally talk in voice chat and text chat because I don't have to worry about someone attacking me because of my identity or because I am a woman. And finding that sense of empowerment was really inspiring, and what makes me really want to continue this research as well. And that one quote, serving a glass of humble juice, made it into my research as the title because that was really empowering in itself. Like doing so good that you're giving them a glass of humble juice was really great. But also finding a sense of escape in video games is important as well. And so I have a minute left, so I did really good on time, but this QR code does take you to my research where it's published right now in CSU ScholarWorks. If you're interested in reading it, I am next steps doing more research and hopefully applying to some PhDs soon. And so if you have any questions for me that I'm not able to get to in the chat today, there is my email. And yeah, thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amanda. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but we'll give people a moment or two to add some. And while they're hopefully doing that, what do you think the next steps are for this research? How would you want to expand it in the future if this was a project you were to continue?
Yes, I would like to really expand it to more communities. I was really limited in a master's program, of course. There's not a lot of time. And so I would really like to discuss how, sexuality in this research as well. It did come up, and unfortunately, I couldn't include it because it didn't really fit this thesis. And so I would really like to look into how homophobia is used to also bring down players, but also how homophobia is used against men who do stand up for women. And I'm also looking into how classism impacts the accessibility of video games as well.
Of course, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. This is what my first research in games was on. But of course, at the time I was doing the study, esports was not quite the industry that it is today. Um, Giving away my age there. But how do you think like esports and live streaming really play into what you're talking about? Because they are kind of by default multiplayer settings. Was that something that players raised when choosing what to play? Esports, live streaming versus perhaps more single player games?
Yeah, I would say esports wasn't discussed a lot by participants, but they did play a lot of the games that are seen in esports. So Overwatch and Dota and Call of Duty were discussed a lot. I included a lot of discussion on esports and how esports has led to this rise of competitiveness in these types of games. And because of the rise of competitiveness, everyone, of course, wants to get to that point. And so it's kind of uh, gone away from this idea of casual play and more so that it's a life and death scenario every game. And so because of that, there's a lot of aggression and hostility if their teammates are not performing well, if the opposing team is beating them. And so it has led to a rise of trash talk. And so that's really interesting to see. But there's also a lot of participants did share that it seemed limited that women couldn't be in esports because all teams had only men in them. And I believe there was only one woman on an Overwatch team. I've gotten away from esports, but I used to watch it a lot. And so the representation wasn't there. So they felt that that wasn't an option for them.
I'm not seeing any other questions. We do have a couple minutes left. Are there any final points you want to share about this research that perhaps you didn't get a chance to get to in your presentation?
Oh my goodness. Yes, that's a big question. I would say it was really interesting doing this research to see, what stories were coming out of it. And one of the things I quickly brushed on but didn't talk about a lot is how every participant was introduced to video game culture by a male figure. No one was introduced by a female figure. And I thought that was very interesting, but I think connects to the point to how video game culture and esports has been marketed towards only for boys and men. And so because of that, it has really kind of led to women and girls feeling like that wasn't for them. They couldn't be part of that community. I did work at a video game store. I'm not saying the name, but I think it's obvious, where I would see parents come in and the mom would say, oh no, video games are for boys, you can't buy a game. Or if they did let them buy a game, it was, a lot of quote unquote cozy games. So a lot of those role playing games that are caretaking, like, kitchen simulators and Diner Dash and Nintendongs and stuff. And so if the girl wanted to play Call of Duty, they were discouraged from that. And so I think it's interesting to see how this idea is not just online, but also in person.
Yes, and a question has come in the chat that I think will be a nice, more positive, perhaps note to end on. It says, were there any examples of positive experiences that were surprising or unexpected?
Yes, actually, COVID was mentioned a lot in this research. Interesting because it has been a while. And one of my participants, she recalled that during COVID, she couldn't see her family. And so she hopped on Grand Theft Auto with her mother-in-law and shared her pregnancy. Like that's how she announced her pregnancy news to her family, was to everyone hop on Grand Theft Auto online and, have a little gender reveal. I had participants who would play Animal Crossing during COVID. And of course, we couldn't have birthday parties. And so they would decorate their house and invite everyone and hop on Discord and just have a little party online. And so it was really sweet. And honestly, I don't know why it was unexpected that there was a lot of positive experiences of community bonding and connectedness in online gaming too. So I think what I put in my research and the conclusion is that it's important to also think about the positive things that we see in video game culture. There is a lot of, social injustices, but it's also important to really think about that, because it also reminded me that I need to consider the positive things that I have had in video game culture. I mean, it launched my research career. So I would say that was the most surprising.
Excellent. And that will bring us to time. So thank you so much, Amanda. And
Thank you.
the person who asked the question said, thanks, those are great little anecdotes to hear despite the toxicity. Great talk. We will now move into a break. We'll be back in about 5 minutes at 6 p.m. Eastern with our next speaker. Thank you so much for joining us today, Amanda, and for sharing your research.
Thank you so much.